Politica, where we explain Israeli politics for the diaspora. I'm Sharon Offenberger here in Australia, and joining me as always is Yuval Regev from Israel. In our last episode, we discussed the new fault lines in Israeli political identity, which no longer really reflect the old models and the language of left and right. There's more of a divide between Israelis into camps that can be defined as religious secular, army service or not serving in the army, and then, of course, only Bibi, anybody but Bibi. But what we described in that episode was the spectrum of the Zionist parties, those that represent the core idea of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. But because it's Israel, it's more complicated. What about the parties and the people that either don't define as Zionist or as Jewish? It brings us to two major population groups, which are referred to as sectors, and the term in Hebrew is migzar. And these are the Haredi, or the ultra-Orthodox, but we're going to call them Haredi in this episode, and the Arab Israelis, who also often refer to themselves as Palestinian citizens of Israel. These sectors vote much more as communities rather than on specific issues, and therefore are also more loyal to their political parties. So we need to start with a disclaimer because we're talking about two very big population groups, and so we were going to speak in a very generalized way. Obviously, there's plenty of nuance, but for the purpose of this episode, we're going to look at the bigger picture. Haredi and Arab Israelis tend to be treated as if they're on opposite sides of the political spectrum, but it's actually not so clear, and sometimes they have more in common than expected. Yuval, welcome.
Shalom, Sharon, and shalom to our listeners. I just wanted to start off by saying, of course, this is a very interesting topic, and we could do an entire podcast just about these topics, right? Just about the Haredim and the Arabs and the way that they vote. I think these are two of some of the most interesting societies, not just in Israel, but maybe even in the world, if you think of the complex reality of where they are positioned. And specifically today, it's Wednesday morning, and the Haredim yesterday came out with a statement that today, between 4 o'clock and 8 p.m., they are going to be effectively protesting and trying to blockade major highways, major routes along all of central Israel. And this has a huge impact on our day-to-day lives. It's not the first time this has happened over the past few weeks. And the issue here is, of course, mandatory conscription. But just to bring you into the fact, everyday Israelis cannot escape the political turmoil. Everyday Israelis cannot escape this impact that these groups have on our lives and the political discourse has on our lives. And we have a big work event coming up tonight, something that we've been working on for months, but we don't know how it's going to happen when effectively all of the central Israel is going to be blocked off. We said maybe we'll take the train, but we know that last time they also blocked the train. So it's an interesting place to be.
So let's really start by looking at the statistics of what is the size of the population. So Haredim currently make up just over 14% of the population, and they're one of the fastest growing populations, not only in Israel, but in the developed world. They're growing at 4% a year. Arab Israelis make up 21% of the population, which is about 2.1 million people. They're mostly Muslim, with a significant Druze and Christian minority. But if you put that together, we're talking about more than a third of the country. So Yuval, let's talk about why the Arab and Haredi sectors are so important in Israeli politics.
Yeah, so I think what makes them so important in Israeli political discourse is what you just mentioned, their size. I think when Israel was established, definitely the founding fathers of Israel didn't presume that these populations would be so big and so dominant in our political discourse. And that has unfolded. And when we look at the Haredim specifically, this is not just a very fast and very quickly growing community. It's also a very young community compared to other Israelis. Right? Haredi community is extremely young. 57% are under 20 compared to 31% of the general population. The average fertility rate for Haredi women is 6.5 children versus 2.2 for non-Haredi Jewish women.
And I understand that even though they make up 14% of the population, they're going to make up about 25 to 30% of new voters in the coming election.
And also the participation in the economy is a big issue here. Haredi men specifically, only about 54% of them have any kind of employment. And when you think about Haredim, and I think this is the main rule for people who are new to this topic, Haredim value and their utmost and most important part of their life is the Torah. And for them, to be a Haredi man is to be someone who devotes their lives to studying Talmud and studying Torah. And that is such an ideological difference from any other population in the world, really. This is a very, very, very devout population that lives a very different and very unique lifestyle to any of us. And what's very interesting also about the Haredi society is that, yes, the men go off to learn Talmud and Torah by large. And by large, Haredi women are actually the ones who are the bread makers of the families. They want to support their men in the quest to learn Torah and to devote their lives to the Torah. And therefore, they work in quite large numbers.
But if they're so dedicated to Jewish life, can you explain why they're not Zionist?
That's a question that goes back to the founding of Zionism. If you know a bit of Zionist and Jewish history, right? Back in the days when Zionism was being founded and was being thought of by Jews who were influenced by nationalist thoughts in Europe and by the Enlightenment and by other more modern and more secular approaches, that's exactly when the Haredi movement, the ultra-Orthodox movement, was saying the exact opposite. Both on tradition, both when it comes to traditional Judaism and the value for, the Torah above anything else in the Jewish identity, but also with a very basic claim that, it's not our time to return to the Holy Land. We have to wait for the Mashiach to arrive.
The Mashiach is the Messiah.
Yeah. So Haredim really don't categorize themselves as part of the Zionist movement. They never have. And the protest movement that we're seeing today is exactly that. They don't want to be included in, specifically, we're talking about in the military, which is really the epicenter of Israeli Zionist identity today. So that's a big rift.
So they don't object to the state of Israel and participate politically, obviously, in the Knesset, but even that had limitations. And for a very long time, they wouldn't serve as ministers in governments. But over time, I think there's a practical acceptance of certain parts of the fact of the state of Israel and other times less so. Interestingly, they do share some similarities with the Arab community. So firstly, they study in a separate education system. So the Israeli education system is more or less divided into 4 streams. So there's Arab schools, so their language of instruction is Arabic. There's what we would call secular schools, or sort of just regular schools for Jewish kids. There's religious schools, and then there's the ultra-Orthodox schools. And 75% of ultra-Orthodox young people study in the ultra-Orthodox streams that are not part of the government education system. They tend to live in towns that are just high levels of their own community. I think 40% of Haredim live just in Jerusalem and in Bnei Brak. And then altogether, there's probably about 20 towns in Israel where they live. With the Arabs, there's many more, but they still tend to live kind of as sectors and within their communities, so they share that in common. They also agree on the importance of religion. So they do actually both share a respect for the importance of religion in public life. There was a very interesting case a number of years ago where there was an attempt to restrict what's called the muazzin, or the call to prayer at a mosque. There was an attempt to legally restrict the volume of that. It was actually the Haredi members of Knesset that came in to oppose it alongside the Arab MKs. There are other issues that they share because they often have larger families and are underemployed in the labour force. In the case of the Haredi community, it's the men that are underemployed. In the case of the Arab community, it's the women who are underemployed. They actually are employed only about half the rate of Jewish women. So they share those sorts of issues which arise from poverty, underemployment, welfare, and having large families. They are non-Zionist, both of them for different reasons. They also don't serve in the army unless they choose to. And even national service, which is an alternative to the army, which is not military, also have very low rates of participating national service. And then a final thing that I noted that they have in common is that Hebrew is not their first language always. So in the Arab community, obviously that's Arabic, but in the Haredi community, so not all of the Haredi community, but in certain parts of it, they actually speak Yiddish as a first language. So these are things that they actually have in common, which is surprising when you think about sort of Haredim and Arabs, that it would appear on the surface that they are completely opposite.
I'd like to put my finger on the big difference. We're talking about 2 societies that are also historically, or at least self-perceived as marginalized, okay? Both the Haredim and the Arabs, they don't see themselves as fitting into the main narrative of, again, Jewish Israeli Zionism. And they do perceive themselves as being discriminated against, being marginalized. And there's also, of course, data to back this up. And of course, marginalized from the workforce, marginalized from academia, from all the centers of power. And they also have, of course, their own segmental media. But the big difference, and this is something that's definitely played out over the past 2-3 decades is that the Haredim have managed to use their political power in the Knesset and to forge coalition governments and to really use the Israeli political system to serve their sectorial interests. And they've done it quite well. And one of the big political issues of this upcoming election and in general of our generation is anger amongst the Israeli public that the Haredim are, receiving these budgets and that the Haredim are exempt from military service and the Haredim are receiving, funding for their yeshivas and funding for further endeavors and funding for their organizations on a much larger scale than, the regular public. And that pisses off a lot of regular Israelis. So the Haredim have done quite an amazing job at integrating into this Israeli political system to get what they want and to, serve their publics, while the Arab parties, unfortunately, haven't been able to do the same.
One of the things that we've mentioned in a previous episode was the voter turnout in the Haredi community, in the Arab community. And we noted that in the Haredi community, it's very, very high, higher than the average Israeli voter turnout. So they were talking upwards of 85%, whereas the average is around 70%. But for the Arab community, that was always much lower. So it would be more like 55, 60, 65%. And I think that's a very interesting observation that if you have a high voter turnout and you're integrated in the system, because they always had to be part of a coalition in Israeli politics. So they were a coalition with the right and then they were a coalition with Labour in the past. It hasn't always been just these natural partners of Netanyahu.
We're historically supportive of the Oslo Accords, and historically supporters of a two-state solution. Today, that's a bit different. But again, it just goes to show that on the spectrum of national politics, really, when it doesn't come to the issues of religion and when it doesn't come to the issues of their own sectorial interests, they're good with anything.
And on the other hand, the Arab parties have always been really, except for one example, which we can talk about, they've been excluded from any coalition government. And so I wonder if some of that voter turnout, there is a lot of voter complacency because, why would you go out to vote if you know that your parties are never going to be part of the decision makers? They were always going to be sort of small minority parties in the opposition that very rarely get listened to. So why would you go out and vote if that was the case? But it is important to note that there is also an uncomfortability often with, as we said in the beginning, the Jewish part of the Jewish and democratic state. And so the Arab sectors haven't felt that they're part of a Jewish state because they're not Jewish. And it isn't helped when there were laws like the nation state law, which got passed in 2018, which was specifically passed to further define the country as the Jewish state and the nation state of the Jewish people. And when the country defines itself in this way, it's hard to expect, I think, Arab voters to be really energized and engaged around the political process. Obviously, many of them identify and relate to their Palestinian identity, which means that they may see participating in the Knesset as giving a hand to the occupation, and that could be something that keeps them away from voting. But it is worth noting that Druze citizens who do army service are much more politically active, vote in higher numbers, and have a stronger, let's say, Israeli identity.
And are also integrated in the Israeli political party. Many Druze are integrated and have seats within the existing Zionist parties.
What I think we find, though, is that Arab voters are increasingly interested in coming out around one of the biggest issues for them. If you said that the big issue for the Haredim, bringing them out to the vote is around army service or trying to evade army service, for Arab voters, I think increasingly it's around safety in their communities. The high numbers of gun violence and murders that take place in their communities, which have been on the rise for a number of years, I think is really motivating them more and more to say we need to take part in this process. We need to be more active in order to address this issue, which is very prominent for them, but is very unlikely to stay within the borders of their own towns for very long. So really, it is a national issue. It is worth noting, however, though, even though the Arab community tends to have a low voter turnout when it comes to national elections, that's not true of local elections where they are very, very active. Arab mayors lead 60 municipalities. And unfortunately, there has only ever been one woman mayor. One of the things they share with the Haredim is they don't do very well on gender equality markers. But when it comes to politics and elections, both communities are considered potential allies, but also as threats. And we've talked about them being a demographic threat in Israel. The Arab community is called a demographic threat, and we'll talk about that in a second. But it's also true for the Haredim that there is this perception and there's this even statement that, the Haredim are a demographic threat in Israel.
Yeah, and I think when you talk to everyday Haredim, they are quite offended. They many times will use the word anti-Semitism to define the way that the secular Israeli public looks at them. Growing up, I was a volunteer with MADA, with MDA, with the Israeli Ambulance Service. And I grew up in the city of Modi'in, which is, a relatively secular / traditional city of, upper middle class, quite a new city that was built in the 90s. Right next to Modi'in, there's another city called Modi'in Elit, and that's a Haredi-only city. And I love doing my ambulance shifts there. I would do night shifts there, and I spent a lot of time with the Haredi paramedics and the medics and the people serving that community. And the reason why we all love doing night shifts was the tremendous amount of deliveries that we had on the ambulances. So 40 kids born a week just in that city. But that divide between Modi'in and Modi'in Elit and the friction between the two cities. And during the holidays, during the periods of holidays where the Haredim are allowed to travel, I'm specifically speaking about Chol HaMoed, Pesach, and Sukkot, they would flock to the parks in Modi'in by the masses. And this triggered, within the secular community of Modi'in, people saying, no, our parks should be to ourselves. We don't want them coming in. And the language sometimes can even become a bit vile, right? The language can sometimes become about, they leave the parks dirty and they don't care about our city. And that kind of language, which is also unfortunately used to dehumanize and discriminate against the Arab population, not just the Haredim. So the language here and the rhetoric here has become, specifically over the past few years, difficult. It's really become a clash of cultures. And I think for both populations, we have the politics of what they want, which is for the side of the Haredim, they want their sectorial interests. They want to not serve in the army. They want funding for their yeshivot. They want funding for their cities and for their endeavors. But we also have the politics of what the society wants of them. When we look at, general Israeli society and what they want of the Haredim is that they want them to integrate. And they want them to integrate into our military, and they want them to integrate into our society, and they want them to, become less Haredi in a way, right? They want them to maybe have a few less kids, maybe, join the workforce, maybe have a different lifestyle. And Haredim want the exact opposite.
The anxiety around that, which is a lot to do with, particularly with the Haredi birth rate. Last year, for the first time, religious first graders outnumbered secular ones. And there is a Central Bureau of Statistics report which actually predicts that 32% of students in 2060 will be ultra-Orthodox. So we're really talking about a very big change in the makeup of the population, of the Jewish population of Israel, leaving aside the Arab population. And at the same time, this is a society that is not participating in the same way as other Israelis, that excludes itself from certain things, including matriculation, finishing high school. They've got very low numbers of people who actually matriculate. So there are actually some anxieties there about what it means for Israel long term. And I think that all of this really needs to be understood within Israel's identity. And this is the identity of a Jewish democratic state. And we sort of always come back to this because this informs so much of Israeli politics, certainly at the moment. Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. It's actually a Jewish and liberal democracy. The Haredim want Israel to be more Jewish, but they want it to be less liberal. They want Israel to be probably electoral democracy, so, happy to go out and vote and get our people into Knesset, but they don't necessarily want the liberal democracy, liberal values, and are really part of what we consider the identity of Israel. So there is a clash there in terms of how different populations are going to affect the identity of the country. And it's also the case with the Arab community, who will identify with the democratic side of Israel, but not with the Jewish side. And why that matters is because, as you've noted, they were once small minorities, but these are becoming large minorities. And it's even tricky because we have two large minorities now who are also very different from each other. Traditionally, the Arab community was considered a demographic threat because they also had high birth rates, although that's less the case now than it was a few decades ago, but mostly because of their identity as part of the Palestinian nation and as part of the Arab world. And in fact, when Israeli and Palestinian demographers count populations, they both count the Arab Israeli population as part of in their numbers.
They do. And we talked a bit about definitions, about how Israeli Arabs define themselves. So you can say Israeli Arabs, You can say Palestinian citizens of Israel. You can say Arab citizens of Israel. But it's very interesting to look at how their neighbors in the West Bank and in Gaza define them. For Palestinians who are not citizens of Israel, they call this group the 48 Arabs, the Arabs of 1948, which basically is, the term as these are the Arabs who were left over, in 48 and somehow have been received citizenship.
There's an additional complication because Palestinians in East Jerusalem, they are counted and they're considered part of Israel because Israel annexed East Jerusalem. They are not citizens, but they are residents. So they can't participate in national elections, but they can participate in local elections. They choose not to. There's an official boycott that's always been the case because they don't recognise Israel's annexation over East Jerusalem. But if they chose a different strategy in the future, this could make things very interesting. So if we're talking again about Israel as a Jewish and democratic state, what would happen to Israel's Jewish identity and majority if Arab citizens, whether in Israel proper or in East Jerusalem, suddenly made up a third or more of Israel's population? But I think that's a topic for another day.
Why are birth rates dropping? And the great answer is because these are residents of a Western capitalist democracy. And birth rates are dropping all around the world for Western capitalist democracies because this correlates with the increase in quality of life and correlates with an increase in education and correlates with an increase in more women in the workforce and more women receiving degrees. By large, Arab citizens of Israel want to integrate, if not into the Israeli narrative, at least into the Israeli economy. If not into the Zionist narrative or way of thought, at least into the democratic narrative and way of thought. To be frank, it's great to live in a democracy. And it's great to be a citizen of a democracy. And not many Arabs in the Middle East have that privilege. And so we can definitely go into institutional marginalization and go into institutional discrimination and go into all the fault lines. But by large, when you look at this society of Palestinian citizens of Israel, these are citizens who have democratic rights and who live in a Western capitalist society where they have opportunities. And that is something that I think very much motivates and impacts who they are.
I will make a little plug here for a documentary film that I made in 2023 with my dear friends in Haifa. It's called Palestinian Citizens of Israel from Their Perspective. We'll drop the link in the show notes. So if you want to learn more about that community and how they see themselves, I would encourage you to go and have a look at that. One of the things you mentioned, Yuval, is economy. And we've talked about Israel's miracle economy and how important it is. But looking ahead, if the Haredi population doesn't integrate into that workforce, Israel's GDP could fall significant if they're not finishing school and are not prepared.
They're not studying English and math. That's a big issue as well, right? We want them to learn those, how do you integrate into a Western capitalist economy if you don't know English or you don't know math and if you only know Torah and Talmud?
So the burden sharing is not really just about army service. It is also the economic burden sharing because at some point, and I know this is a sensitive topic, but, who are paying the taxes? The people who are working have to pay more taxes to support the people who are not working or earning less. So there starts to be an inequality across quite a few different variables there, which are really a real irritant.
Sharon, it's not just an irritant. This is the baseline of many political campaigns over the past decade in the Israeli left and center. Just now, I was on Instagram and I was scrolling and I saw a campaign done by the Demokratim, right, the most left-wing Zionist party in Israel. And they had me answer a questionnaire, how many kids I have, how much money I make. And then they had a calculator calculate how much of my income is going to fund Haredim. That's a big statement. That's a big campaign. And I remember 15 years ago when Yair Lapid made his way into the Israeli political field, kind of ushering the age of the Israeli center, that was his main ticket issue. Shivyon banetel was the word, which means equality in the burden. And that is also the economic burden of participating in the workforce and paying taxes, and also, of course, the burden of serving in the military. So these are big ticket political issues that really motivate the Israeli secular voter, and that also really alienate the Haredi voter, who, again, perceives these intentions as trying to diminish the Haredi way of life. They really perceive this as anti-Semitism.
A lot of people say that this is a community in crisis or in transition, and that its leadership is doing everything it can to try and maintain it as it was. But in reality, it is actually more fragmented than it used to be, and also more aware of the outside world. You can't keep people in this sort of digital age. You can't just keep people in kind of closed communities.
They try very hard. Yeah.
So they have They do have smartphone and internet exposure. And I think one of the things that they are aware of and potentially need to feel like they need to make a change around is around their economic situation, because more than 50% are considered as living in poverty. But this is also, to a certain extent, chosen. This is a chosen lifestyle of living this way in order for men to study Torah. Having the children that they do is one factor, but it really is the underemployment there that is creating that poverty. And that's a choice. That's a choice that they're making. And it's not sustainable for the country, but I also don't think it's sustainable for a community long term when everyone around them is living differently, that they would continue to live in that way. I think that one of the problems is there's sort of no third way. You're like either completely in or you're completely out. If there was some kind of integration that allowed for, somewhat enough of the Haredi community that keep their practices, but also participate in, a Western economy. We have Haredi people in Australia and in other Western countries. They participate in the economy. They're out there on the train with women. I mean, there are ways that you can remain Haredi and still be in a Western country and be part of it, but keep your traditions and keep your faith still strong. As you've mentioned, I think the Arab community is also changing. There is increasing appetite to have the Arab parties participate in government. I saw a survey that said something like 70% of Israelis think that an Arab party should join the next government. It is a little bit make or break because you can't really have a coalition without the Haredi parties or the Arab parties. So this is a really hot topic, not just in terms of the community, but this is a very important topic in terms of the election.
We talked about the dynamics of Israeli coalition building. If all the Zionist parties came together and said, we can put our Bibi, not Bibi differences aside, so in theory, you could form a government without the Haredim and without the Arabs. And governments like that have been formed before. I'm speaking about the way that they are perceived by Zionist society, okay? Is really who are you, which pill are you willing to swallow? Okay? Are you willing to form a coalition with the Haredim and then swallow the pill of allowing them to have an exemption from military service and allowing them to continue having this marginalized education system that doesn't provide Israel with the engineers and with the workforce people that, our economy needs? So are you willing to swallow the Haredi pill? Or on the other side, are you willing to swallow the Arabi pill, the Arab pill, which means accepting the fact that people who are non-Zionists and who might be supportive to the Palestinian cause and who might define themselves as Palestinian, integrated into our society? This has been tested in the very short-lived government of change, led by Naftali Bennett and Yair Lapid before the election of this government. They didn't integrate an Arab party into their actual government, but they held a majority in the Knesset with the support of one of the Arab parties. Now, important to say, this is an Arab party that its main denominating factor is Islam. This is an Arab party that represents what we call the Southern Muslim Brotherhood in Israel. It's a very interesting dynamic and story, okay? This is an Arab party that defines as Muslim, and that is going to say, defines less with the Palestinian national cause. So it was easier for them to be a partner, but this party was normalized by Netanyahu himself, who had reached out to this party and said, maybe form a Knesset coalition with me. But I mean, the minute that this government was, in fact, created with the support of an Arab Muslim party in the Knesset, you can only imagine the rhetoric coming from the Likud, coming from Netanyahu. How dare you form a government with terror supporters? How dare you form a government with people who want us dead? When we talk about Arabs in Israeli political discourse, there was a big election in 2015. This is the election where Netanyahu was up against Tzipi Livni and Bushi Herzog, and it was neck and neck, right up until the end. And we remember a very, very famous video posted by Netanyahu on his social media the morning of the election. And he said, "Ha'aravim noharim lekalpiyot, behamuneihem, be'otobusim shel hashmol." Let's translate that to English. The Arabs are making their way to the ballot boxes by large on buses funded by the left. So what was he basically saying to his voter base? He's basically saying, be careful, go vote. You have to turn up. You have to vote for the right. You have to vote for the Likud, because on the other side, the Arabs are showing up. The sentiment of fear of the Arabs and fear of what they would do if they would be integrated into Israeli politics is very easily manipulated by the Israeli right.
But the Israeli right wing, at least amongst the voters or people define themselves as right, the marriage with the Haredim is actually wearing thin now over the issue of army service. And the Israeli opposition really have no choice but to find a way to work with the Arab community, which holds a key to their future government, and that is just their sheer voter numbers. So these are two very interesting communities to watch in terms of what's going to happen. They make up an important part of the fabric of Israeli society, as we mentioned, but for our purposes on this podcast, they will very much make up an important part of coalition formation process following the elections. Their relative size, however, demands also a very good hard look in the mirror for Israel's continued identity as a Jewish and liberal democracy. They're already a third of the country. These communities are growing, or in the case of East Jerusalem Palestinians, they're just being included into the Israeli population numbers. And so what happens to Israel's identity as a Jewish and liberal democracy is really something that has to be considered long term. And so what's the role of the Jewish diaspora? In fact, ultra-Orthodox are actually expected to make up 25% of all Jews by 2050. So this is increasingly an issue that is coming up in our own communities about what being Jewish in the diaspora is going to look like long term. In the diaspora, we tend to romanticize this idea of the Jewish state because for us, religion is a private matter. We have choice. We're not coerced in any way. But we rarely ask, what kind of Jewish? In Israel, for the ultra-Orthodox, there is only one kind of Jewish. We have Jewish pluralism, which they reject. From praying at the Kotel to marriage laws, there's only one accepted form of Jewish practice, and it remains the case because of the ultra-Orthodox Haredi political influence. That this is an issue they manage to keep over the rest of the government. It's not that the rest of Israel thinks this way. When we say Jewish state, we mean a country for the Jewish people, but when they say Jewish state, they mean living according to Jewish law, to halakha. I considered myself fortunate to have spent a lot of time with both communities in Israel through my work with civil society. I actually come from an Orthodox Jewish education system, and I can still recite Birkat Hamazon, which really impressed the Haredim. But I also lived and called Ajami, an Arab neighborhood in Jaffa, home for many years. So I also felt more of an affinity with my Arab neighbors than I did with Jewish ultra-Orthodox. Ultimately, these communities will need to have greater integration politically, socially, and economically. The question is, who is that up to? Is it up to Israeli society or is it up to them? Either way, the future of these communities is a big part of the story of the future of Israel, which is what we're here to discuss. Give us a follow and a like if you enjoy Politica, and be sure to listen to some of the Jewish Independent's other great podcasts. A new season of Tensions Transplanted with Rob Caldor and Izzy Otterberg is out now on TJI channels, where they go into a deep dive about how the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is changing our society. Stay tuned for more Politica, and until next time, keep the volume down.
And shkoyach.